Now that you've done some negotiating, you have a general idea of the lease terms you can expect. So it's time for analysis. You only need to focus on your short list, and that list may be even shorter after your final tours. Personally, I like to have a minimum of 3 properties at this stage. The financial comparison is usually the highest priority. You can do your own or have your broker do it. I recommend a simple side-by-side comparison. Let's leave this slide for a moment so I can show you an example. This is a good version of a side-by-side comparison. For simplicity, we're only looking at 2 properties. At the top, you can see photos of the 2 prospective properties and columns directly below them containing info about each one. It starts with basic info like the address and the size, then rent per square foot per month, then rent per square foot per year, the total cash out of pocket in nominal dollars, followed by the same thing as a net present value. Then it shows info about lease commencement and rent commencement, which are not always the same. As you can see, the property on the right has a lease commencement of July 1st, but the rent commencement is the following January 1st because it has 6 months of free rent, which is also shown a few lines down in the row titled Months of Free Rent. Below that, it shows the total expected construction cost stated in dollars per square foot. The left property is a renewal of the space this tenant is currently occupying, while the right property is a new space, which is why you see a significant difference in the cost of construction. Below that, in the row titled TI allowance, is the landlord's contribution to the construction cost. And finally, in the bottom 2 rows, you have the net cost of the tenant both in dollars per square foot and the actual dollar amount. There are many incarnations of these reports, and you or your broker should design it based on the metrics that are important to the key decision makers. If they don't care about monthly rent per square foot, then remove it from the report. I see too many financial reports with all kinds of clutter and useless information. Make yours streamlined and informative. Back to our slide. You also need to consider the non-financial key terms. For example, renewal and expansion rights, termination rights, sublease rights, and parking. These can be incredibly important terms of a lease that can actually outweigh the financial terms. I've seen many people get too focused on the financial analysis and forget about these elements. You can include them in your spreadsheet, or you can create a new document showing the comparison. Here's the same financial comparison we looked at earlier, but if you look down at the bottom, here, you can see that I added a section for non-financial terms. The left property has better financial terms, but now you can see that only the right property has a termination right and it has more parking. Also, the left property has some restrictions on subleasing, so it changes the picture a bit. You don't necessarily need to represent it the way I did in this spreadsheet. This is just one way of doing it. The main point is to make sure that you include non-financial terms in your analysis. The final piece of analysis I recommend is a test fit, which is also called a fit plan. This is prepared by an architect or space planner and shows how your furniture and your people will fit in the space. Here's an example of a test fit. You can see that this is more robust than a floor plan because it has not only the hard walls in the space but also furniture. So you can estimate the number of people the space will accommodate. If you look at the bullet point list on the right, it indicates that this space has 16 private offices, 1 executive suite, 4 conference rooms, a break room, and 82 cubicles that are 8 by 8 feet. This gives you a very good idea of how well your company or department might fit in this space. In many cases, a landlord will already have test fits done and might be willing to do more that are tailored to your furniture specifications. After you have your test fits for your short list of prospective spaces, I recommend getting rough cost estimates for each one. Consult with your space planner, your architect, your furniture vendor, and your IT consultant. You don't need a formal bid, but it's helpful to get an idea of cost for each location because the differences might be significant. The next step is to conclude your negotiations and come to an agreement on basic terms. That means you will need to have a completed LOI. Make sure all your analysis is updated. The terms of the deal will change as you go through a negotiation, and sometimes people forget to keep their spreadsheets and other forms up to date, especially if they're pursuing multiple properties at the same time. And don't be afraid to negotiate a little more to get the best deal possible. When you're satisfied that you've done that, then it's time to choose a winner and reach a final agreement. But it's imperative to have at least one backup, and I would recommend having 2 or 3. You never know what's going to happen, and it's simply too risky to focus on only one property and hope everything works out. As we discussed earlier, you may want to sign the LOI. In most cases, I recommend signing it because it shows good faith and it prevents confusion about which one is the final version. Again, you should consult with your attorney on this issue. At this point, theoretically, you have a deal, but don't celebrate yet because the lease document is its own negotiation and things can change dramatically during that process. Now that you have an agreed-to letter of intent, it's time to start the legal review. But wait, before you do that, this is a good time to stop and do a reality check. When you reach this point, many months will have passed since the project first started, and who knows what might have changed. I've seen some companies sign a lease for a project that had already been canceled. In that case, they immediately put their new space on the market for sublease without ever having moved in. It sounds crazy, but it happens. So this is a time to circle back with key decision makers and make sure nothing has changed. You might even execute an additional approval form. This one with much more detail since you now know the specific location, size, and other lease terms. If you're the key decision maker, then review the reasons you started this search and make sure you reach the same conclusion. Above all, have confidence that you want to move forward. Okay, now let's talk about legal review. The landlord will draft the lease document and present it to you for review. Before handing it off to your attorney, have your broker review it carefully to make sure it's consistent with the terms of your letter of intent. There's no reason to spend money having your attorney do this, and more importantly, your broker will be better at spotting mistakes because he or she helped you negotiate the LOI and therefore understands not only the terms, but also the spirit of the agreement. What I mean is that sometimes the intent of the parties doesn't get translated correctly into the lease document. It can be hard for an attorney to spot that by only reviewing the letter of intent. It's much easier for someone who is involved in the negotiation from start to finish. So let your broker do the first review. It's critical to use the right attorney. I've seen enormous mistakes and complications happen when the attorney doesn't have the right expertise. A good example is that sometimes companies will try to use their in-house counsel to save money. Unfortunately, they often don't understand the nuance of an office lease or the issues that are specific to that market. You want someone who has deep experience with your type of lease in your location. That doesn't mean the attorney has to be located in that area. It just means that he or she needs experience working on leases in that location. I recommend that your broker and attorney be in direct contact. This will help your broker inform your attorney about any inconsistencies between the lease draft and the letter of intent. He or she can also describe why certain provisions were included in the lease. It's important for your attorney to understand why you agreed to some of the terms. Your attorney will create a red line draft showing all of his or her proposed changes to the lease, which you or your broker will then submit to the landlord. There is often quite a bit of back and forth while you negotiate the finer points of the lease. Your broker should be closely involved throughout this process and should be included in all correspondence. His or her input is important because there's a lot of overlap between business points and legal points. It's not uncommon for attorneys from each party to arrange a conference call to discuss their differences of opinion. You and your broker should be present on those calls. A final word of caution. When it gets close to the end, sometimes people get battle weary and wind up agreeing to things they shouldn't. Do your best to fight hard for anything you consider important. When the legal review is complete and you're happy with the lease, it's time to sign. There are a few things to know about lease execution. When you receive the final version, make sure it's correct. There are a lot of versions that get passed around during a negotiation, and it's possible to get the wrong one by accident. Your attorney will help you confirm that the final version has all the changes that were agreed to. Make sure you know who will sign the lease and confirm that person is authorized to do so. Don't assume based on someone's title that they have the authority to execute this document. Typically, you will sign first, and then the landlord will countersign. Therefore, before you sign, find out how many originals your company needs and how many the landlord needs. Then present the landlord with that number of signed originals. So if your company needs 3 and the landlord needs 2, that means you need to sign 5 and give them all to the landlord, who will then return 3 countersigned originals. After that, guess what? You're done. Your final task is to make sure the world knows how awesome you are. This concludes the course titled A Guide to Leasing Office Space. I truly hope that you found it informative, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.